Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you'll find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and the past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 55, our guest today is Mary Latham, the inspiring force behind the More Good project. Mary's journey began as a heartfelt response to the overwhelming negativity in the world, sparked by the tragic events of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting and deeply influenced by the passing of her beloved mother. Following her mother's advice to focus on positive stories and acts of kindness, Mary set out on a mission to find and share these stories across America. We discuss the origins of her mission, her experiences traveling to all 50 states in her mother's old Subaru, and the remarkable tales of good deeds she encountered along the way. Mary shared insights into the transformative power of focusing on positivity and the incredible hospitality she received from strangers. We also talk about her plans with compiling these stories into a book. Our conversation delved into the impact her project has had on communities and individuals, the lessons she's learned from her travels, and her ongoing efforts to spread the message of more good. So I hope you enjoy episode 55 with Mary Latham. This episode was recorded May 20th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So I'd like to start off with a little introduction where you were born and raised.
So I was born in Orient, and that's where I was raised there also. So.
And how far back with your ancestry, even from Orient or before there, with either of your parents?
So my father's family, the Lathams, have been there a really long time. It actually goes back to Carrie Latham, coming from England in around 1631. He was in the Massachusetts area. And then I believe he built the first home in Groton, Connecticut. He worked with Governor Winthrop on getting a boat from Groton to New London and worked a lot with him, and then eventually had a son who was called Oyster Ponds, I believe, Point, now Orient Point, that property, and gave it to his son, Jonathan Fish. Jonathan Fish did some farming, but also ran an Orient Inn there, which I just found out Walt Whitman stayed at and wrote the famous poem Leaves of Grass at that inn that my relative ran.
Wow.
But Jonathan Fish is kind of where it all comes down from. My family, Terry Latham, who runs Latham Sand and Gravel, Danny Latham, who has Latham's Farm Stand, we kind of all stem from Jonathan Fish, and he was moved to Orient in 1796.
Wow. And that comes all the way to your grandparents and your dad?
Yeah, they would go sometimes, get work in the city or further up Nassau County, but a lot of them came back to Orient, like myself.
And what about your dad's father? Was he living out here as well?
He was more so they actually had a lumber business, and so they were in the Port Washington area, and there was also Latham Brothers, which was a lumber business there too, and inevitably my dad got into the lumber business. It's actually where he met my mom. She was one of the very few women working in the lumber business at the time, and they ended up moving out to Orient to start their family, and my dad started his own lumber business in Riverhead.
Wow. And could you talk a little bit about your mom's side ancestry a little bit?
Yeah, my mom's side came from Ireland. So her great-grandparents had been from Ireland, and then she was also raised, though, in Nassau County area. But yeah, I have a lot more to learn about her side and her heritage. I'll have to ask my aunt now or other family relatives since she's gone.
Yes. You mentioned your dad started the lumber business in Riverhead. Was your mom working?
Yes, they worked together. So it was, they were married and worked together. But yeah, that was in Riverhead. And my mom had, her father had worked in the lumber business up island at Latham Brothers Lumber. And so when she started college, she would work there on Saturdays with him. And she went to a conference of lumber people. She was the only woman there. So I think all the guys were asking to buy her a drink. And my dad offered her a glass of water, and they've been together since then. So yeah.
Yeah. And then, so do you have multiple siblings?
Yes, I'm the youngest of 4 children. So I have an older brother who lives in Wyoming now, and then 2 sisters who are both Greenport and Orient. So.
And in terms of your childhood, how was it growing up in Orient, and what kind of activities would you do outside of school or on the weekend? Even as, I guess, it could be through elementary, middle school, high school. So
I feel very fortunate for the childhood I had, just because, going to Oyster Ponds and just the group of friends are still my best friends today. We've been best friends since 3 years old when we went to the Orient Congregational Church. So I feel very lucky to have that connection. I loved horses growing up. So my father had a friend who gave us a free horse, as they call it, which of course there's no such thing as a free horse. We got him, and then the feed and waking up every morning. I think I was in about 5th grade when we got the horse, and just my mom always used to love to tell the story of how my grades and me as a person completely shifted once I got the horse, because every morning I had to wake up, at 5:30 in the morning and muck the stalls and feed him before going to school. And then, sometimes get made fun of at school that my sneakers smelled like manure. But my grades went from like C's and B's to A's after that. And just like that feeling of responsibility and taking care of something. And so trail riding and stuff, I wasn't into competing. And then just visiting friends and like playing in the woods and walking around the beach and stuff like that. I think it was just like a lot of time outside and just being really creative. I grew up without television. So that makes you have to learn how to entertain yourself instead of staring at a box. So me and my one friend, Allie, would always put on plays. And her dad had an old VHS, and we were dying to look for these videos still. But we had all these videos of us, and we would like write plays and scripts and do them outside. And it was just really fun.
What did your parents say why they decided on that at the time?
Where I grew up in Orient was kind of off the grid. So I think in general, it would have been expensive to get cable lines down to our houses at the time. But I think it was mostly just, they were like, look where you live, you like go outside and play in the woods, go to the beach. Like, we lived in such a beautiful place. We were really fortunate. And so I'm so, I had to complain all through high school and be bitter, but I'm so grateful that they did that, because it was such a blessing.
And I was curious, when everyone, I guess, from Orient switches to the Greenport High School, but how was that transition over to Greenport? Because you met, I guess you had to meet new students and in a different environment. How was that?
So I grew up going to CCD. So there was a decent amount of the kids in my class I knew. We had been going to CCD together since 2nd grade, and they were in Greenport, and, the Oyster Ponds kids and Greenport kids would get together Tuesday nights at CCD. So that helped know some of the kids. I also had a sister that was a senior. That was a huge help. Not that she acknowledged me in the hallway, but all of her friends did. And they were really nice. And so just to have that feeling of walking down a hallway and getting a high five from like one of the football players, like, was pure bliss. So that was a huge help to kind of acclimating. But I do remember being paranoid about like the lockers and like figuring, like I would just carry all my books in my backpack because I was so scared I wouldn't have time to go to my locker or wouldn't be able to do the code. So I would just carry every single book in my LL Bean backpack all around 7th grade. But yeah, it was it did feel a little daunting because Oyster Ponds is so small. But it was not that bad.
And in terms of even subject matter that you kind of gravitated towards in high school that you were interested in?
I mean, I liked English class because I liked, writing essays and stuff. And, I think I was just kind of really focused on following in my sister's footsteps. She was valedictorian, and it was a blessing and a curse to have her in the school because all the teachers kind of put that pressure on you. Like, not all of them, but a couple of them really were like, oh, well, your sister got 100 on this region, so you only got like a 94. And I'd be like, cool. So I think that I was just so focused on doing well in school, but I don't remember having a specific passion about a subject besides like creative writing or sports. Like I love doing things outside, but I wasn't like excited about science or history at the time. Now I regret it. I wish I'd paid attention in history more.
Yeah. But coming out of high school, did you know what you wanted to pursue? Or
I went to school to be an education and Spanish major. So that was the good joke. I can't speak a lick of Spanish, and I'm not a teacher, but I did really want to go that route. I wanted to be a special education teacher. And then I went to a liberal arts college. So it was pretty forgiving in figuring out what you want to do. But then I ended up getting into photography more and then going a graphic design photography route instead. But I love children, and I think maybe someday I'll go back to teaching. But I think right then I was like, oh, I kind of really like this photography idea. And so eventually, which led me to my wedding photography business.
Was that wasn't something you were doing in high school, or just finding an interest early on in photography?
I actually had a best friend, Joy Medina, and she had been a foster child that grew up in East Marion. I met her at Oyster Ponds, and she would come over all the time. And I remember I was in second grade, third grade when we started this. I was so young, so I didn't really understand completely what was going on. I knew that she didn't have a solid home and she'd get taken away sometimes, and that she had a difficult life, but I couldn't comprehend it, and I didn't know really how difficult it had been at the time. But I remember knowing she had a hard life, and she was like always smiling and just like this joy to be around, and she was just such a beautiful person. And I remember being like studying her, like almost so inspired by her, that she was this happy personality when she went through such a challenging childhood. So I used to dress her up in my sister's and my sister is like almost 6 feet tall. Joy is like barely 5. And I used to dress her up in her old prom dresses, and I would like sit her on like the rock on the beach and take pictures of her with my disposable camera. But I remember studying and finding people very interesting, and stories, but she was definitely my muse since I was like a little kid.
Yeah.
But I never thought that it could be a career, or that I would ever make money or be able to really pull it off. So it was kind of just always a hobby for a really long time.
And it was just something, even this was after your bachelor's?
So when I started taking pictures of Joy, I was in second grade, but I got into my photography full time I guess I got interested in photography in college, probably junior year, and really went that route, and then didn't take off in my wedding photography business till like full time till after my mom died. And I kind of just got the courage to just try anything.
Yes. So after college, did you go to New York City?
I did. I went to New York City. I worked for some fashion photographers, installing their air conditioners and buying them coffee. Learning nothing. Just free labor. So that was really rough. And then I ended up getting a job at the Practicing Law Institute, which was a continuing legal education firm there. I had an assistant job. I was in the online department. It was back when we were making CDs and MP3s. And providing them to lawyers to get their credits. And so I was kind of behind locked doors with all the equipment and a bunch of guys that were doing the tech stuff. And I was like ordering lunch for everyone. And so that was a period of time where it was a job that I maybe had 3 hours of work really a day, doing some purchase orders and ordering their lunch. And, you know, a lot of people are kind of, if they had that job at the time, they were kind of bumming off and going on Facebook or whatever they were doing, watching movies at work. I started taking online business courses, learning how to build a website and editing wedding photos, and would like through my lunch and stay late at work and stuff and just use all the availability to the equipment that I was provided for work anyway. And so that's kind of how it really took off after that.
And you had left the job, was that in 2013?
Yeah, so I was there. I probably would have still been there today, honestly. It was like such a comfortable job. I had health insurance. I had stability. I loved the people I worked with. It was not at all my passion. I didn't want to go that route and be a lawyer, but it was giving me that comfort and stability. And then I was shooting on the weekends and stuff. But after my mom passed, I kind of took that leap of faith to give my notice at that job, and I ended up moving to the Caribbean and doing wedding photography full time there, and just kind of getting back on my feet, I guess, after she died.
But the story kind of started while you were still working there in terms of the More Good project.
Yes.
Could you discuss a little bit how that came about?
So I was working on the day of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. It was a Friday, and I had just gotten into work, was opening my computer, and it was all over the news, obviously. He was still an active shooter. It was around 9 a.m. That morning. And so I was going through the news, and again, because I grew up without television, I mean, I even remember 9/11, like my parents had the newspapers upstairs. Like it was just like not completely, but like a little bit of shielding of the bad. And so I wasn't exposed to that. I wasn't used to it. And I became obsessed, and was refreshing. And I nannied for a family at the time that had a 6-year-old child, and I was supposed to be babysitting that night. So I just was so traumatized, like we all were. And as I was looking, my coworker stopped by my desk, and he was like, "Oh, you should have come to Starbucks this morning." And I was ignoring him, staring at the news. And I said, "Yeah, I can afford it." And he said, "No, it was free." And I kind of turned around, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he was like, "Well, there was a guy in there buying gift cards," because it was right before Christmas. And he was buying a bunch of gift cards as presents, I guess, for employees. And he bought one last one for $100 and said, "Run it out on all the people that are in the line behind me." And my coworker, Brian, at the time, his wife had just left him. He was turning 30. His mom had passed from cancer that year, and he had back surgery that year. I mean, it just wasn't his year. And I can still see him. I mean, his face, he was glowing about this free coffee this stranger bought him. And it was just like such a beautiful moment. And you hear about them happening, and I was like so happy it happened to him. And he was so excited about it. And he walked away from my desk, and I called my mom, and I told her right away the story. I used to call her every morning. She'd go on and for hours about the living room renovation she was doing. And it was just so nice to just hear her voice. I'd be doing work and just listening to her. And so I told her this story, and then I kind of quickly switched over to the shooting. She didn't know about it because no TV in the house. And so I was telling her all about it, and I just was like, "Mom, like, how is there this much, like, how am I going to babysit tonight and not crying this kid? How is there so much bad out there?" And she was like, "Mary, you have to remember that other story you just told me. You know, there's always going to be tragedies and horrible things that will inevitably happen in our lives and in the world, but there will always be more good out there if you look for it." And so that kind of concept of the more good being out there ended up becoming a bit of a life raft, because she passed away a few weeks later from cancer. And in that time between her telling me to focus on it, I had started a little Facebook page with a friend. So she knew about that. I launched on Valentine's Day, and 2 months later after that conversation, and I created a website for it. We called it the Gratitude Project, with 2 T's, like attitude. And we would ask people to send any stories of human kindness they had in. And after we launched on Valentine's Day, 11 days later, my mom ended up in Sloan Kettering. They did a procedure that was unsuccessful, and we were kind of sat down and told she has a couple hours, maybe days. That initial 24 hours was obviously shock, and kind of gathering the whole family to come in right away. My sisters were out here on Long Island, and my brother was in Delaware. And so we were all kind of congregating in the waiting room. And I remember I had set up a separate email at the time for the the Gratitude Project at the time. And I wasn't thinking about it at all. I wasn't thinking about anything good. And, finally I had to open my personal email just to say to my jobs, I'm out for a little while now and I'll let you know. And when I opened the personal email, I had a story someone sent me in. They didn't know the Gratitude email address, so they just sent it to me personally. It was actually a local Monica Slajeski who grew up in Orient. And she had sent me this really beautiful story, and she had already lost both of her parents. And I knew that. And so to read her story of an act of kindness someone had done for her that had brought her to tears and was such a beautiful thing, knowing she went through twice what I'm about to go through and seeing someone like her still focusing on the good was like this shred of hope during that time. And I remember I read the story to the rest of my family and we're all sitting in the waiting room crying. And then I thought, what am I doing? Here I have access to all these stories. We're just sitting here. My mom ended up lasting a few more days. And it was just the worst week of our lives and we're just sitting waiting. And so I started reading a few of the stories, and that was kind of where the project was born, really, in her death, and that I wanted to provide something for people that had to sit in those rooms next. I was so lucky I had my family. My parents were married 40 years. Like, I'm one of 4 kids. Like, it was just, I had such a nice group around me, and there was a guy in there in the corner alone, I remember, and there was a couple in there, and they were divorced, and they were fighting. Their daughter was dying, and it was just like, for an already depressing room, it just was like, it felt so hopeless. And so I just thought maybe and nothing was in there, like not even a magazine about Kim Kardashian's new, nail color or whatever, but it was just empty. And so to provide a little bit of hope in those rooms. So I thought, I'm going to go out there and look for it and compile as much as I can and put them in some books to donate to these rooms.
Wow. And you had left your job in the city, and then were you working down in the Caribbean?
Yeah, so I left in 2013, and I moved to St. John the day before New Year's, actually. So going into 2014. I moved home to help my dad through the first set of holidays. And so we kind of got through Thanksgiving and Christmas, which was really nice because I grew up 3 houses away from my grandparents. Who both lived till 96 and 97, my dad's parents. And so my dad would go over there every night, for a thimble of wine, we'd call it, around 5:30. And so I started joining him on that, which was really nice because my grandfather passed the following year and I had been in the island then. So I had those couple of weeks where I had a thimble of wine with him every night at 5:30, which was awesome. But I was in the Caribbean on and off for the next 2.5 years, and then kind of got myself ready to go on this trip. I think I thought for a long time, I need to be a little bit more healed to go on a trip where I'm going to listen to other people and try to help them and all this stuff. But the healing, it's such a weird process, like after I got off the road, I felt more broken than before I even got on. Like, I wouldn't call it a healing journey by any means, but I do think I needed that time to kind of figure out what I was about to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just having that life-changing situation, and then in some ways you still need some form of time, and like you took the time off from work, but then it's like I need to do something else. But while you had started that, thinking about that project and getting some stories through the emails, you were thinking at that time, even over those kind of 2 years, that you wanted to go to the 50 states and just gather stories?
Yeah, so in the hospital, I
right away
created it. Yeah, it was immediate because I had to hang on to something that kept her alive, I think. So I knew I had to do something to honor her. I knew I wanted to go to all 50 states because I feel like we all make jokes about different states and thinking we know what they're like. I mean, me, myself, I'm a victim, or not a victim, I'm guilty of doing it, where, I make fun of New Jersey and call it the armpit of America because I have a friend that lives there and I obviously have to, say New York is better. Of course, annoyingly, New Jersey had great stories. But just to show there really is good everywhere in all different areas of our country. And not just visit the big cities, but go to a small town too. So that was really important to me at the time. And I think I knew without knowing really that I was going to have to leave to do it, because a couple of weeks after she had passed, people weren't really sending stories in as much anymore. It's kind of like any project you have. It has this like wave of excitement in the beginning, and then you go a couple months in and it's lost that. And so instead of getting discouraged that I wasn't getting any positive stories, I figured I'm just going to go out there and dig them up myself. So that's basically what I finally did. But I was back here. I was living with my dad. I was doing wedding photography still, which was tough because I thought at first, and it was really challenging, but I just thought I'd be crying at every wedding because there's these moms putting their daughters in their wedding gowns, and now I'll never have that. So I think at first I was really nervous to continue that type of career. But then I realized it really, after she passed, like it just changed the way I saw everything. And I remember one specific wedding where the mother was there and her daughter, but the mother's mother had passed recently. And, you know, she had some type of locket on or something, and I noticed it on her hand, and then she took it off, and I had this picture of her and her daughter's hand with it, and was like, but it was like taking this moment out to do this and seeing it and noticing it. And then, you know, all the girls, the bridesmaids, were getting ready and laughing and doing something, and the mom had like tears in her eyes and was just like, thank you so much for doing that. It just made me see everything differently than just a wonderful, well-lit photo of her looking beautiful on a beach. It's like those tiny moments at a wedding that are also really significant, and also show the bride and groom, like, you're not just a client. Like, I'm your friend now. No, but like, you know, and I do stay in touch with a lot of them, but just like really, you know, I want to know them as a person, and like, you know, some of the people that don't get to make it to the wedding and stuff, still honoring them too.
And now getting to the trip, because you started in Orient, going off to the Crosstown Ferry. Yeah. But maybe the month or two before, or like a few days before, I was curious what your dad was thinking. Was he in some ways kind of saying, well, why are you doing this? Or you don't have to, or was he nervous about, or was he supportive in that way?
He was definitely very supportive. My entire family has been the entire time. I think it helped when I got a one-way ticket to the Caribbean after my mom died. I think they were like, oh, okay, this is what she's gonna do. So that was like the start of them realizing she's gonna say these crazy things, but she is gonna actually do them. And so they knew I was gonna do this. I think they knew I needed to do this in a lot of ways. But I do think that the one thing he kept saying, and one of my sisters, was that, you know, you don't have to leave on October 29th. Now, of course, I had told everyone that. I made little pamphlets about it. Like, you know, that was a date. It had no significance. It was just a date, October 29th. If I didn't pick it, I don't think I would have ever left. Like, it was like I needed something locked in my mind. It's just kind of the way I function. But I remember I had finished my last wedding, was the 15th that year of my season, and I was just had all of these weddings to edit and all this stuff, and I hadn't really packed, and it was just like crunch time. And the morning I was leaving to go on the ferry, I went to breakfast with I was living with my friend Erin in Greenport at the time, and we had one final breakfast together. And I remember we went to Crazy Beans, and I think I had like 2 sips of water, and just watched her. She was like having pancakes and like a Reese's Pieces latte. I don't remember what she was, but it was delicious breakfast. My stomach was in a million knots. I was officially freaked out. I finally took one bite of toast, and I broke a hole in my tooth with that one bite. And so I had to rush to a dentist. I had to call the ferry and push it. My dad was like, see, just go tomorrow. I was like, I have to go today. So I went to the dentist. They patched it. I made the next ferry and started the trip. The hole in my mouth.
Wow. And then at the same time, when you had initially started, were you thinking what your mom might have thought about you doing this trip? You think she would, when she told you the part about goodness and good, and there's more good, would you think she might have said, well, I didn't mean for you to just start a whole journey
Yeah,
like this.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. I think that she was like, whoa, I meant go look in your community. You'll see a little kindness. Wonderful. There's good out there. Not go stay with strangers for 3 years, you lunatic. So yeah, she was probably like freaking out up there. But my dad actually took me to the cemetery before I went to the ferry. He drove with me to the ferry, and some of my best friends from that Orient Congregational Church were there to wave me off when I left. But I remember he took me to the cemetery, and we got out and we just stood there for a second, and he said, well, what do you think you'd be doing today if she was here? And I just said, well, not this crazy stuff. I mean, what am I doing? He's like, we're both wondering. But anyway, yeah. And then, but it is, yeah, I don't think this was her intention by any means. And I think that you don't obviously have to spend 3 years and 31 days on the road to necessarily see that there are good places. And I think that a lot of the good is going to be within yourself. And that's kind of like the lesson, is that if you want to see it, you kind of have to be it too. And spread it yourself. It's kind of like a magnetic thing. But I had to do that trip, I think, for a million reasons. But it was definitely, it really creates empathy when you see all the things you see. And so I think it's so important. And when we think of travel, we always think, oh, like Paris or Italy, which are wonderful options too. But there's so many really beautiful places in our country too. And I think the second we get out of our comfort zone, even like those memories you have if like you miss a flight and you're so frustrated, but then you end up at the airport bar and you meet the person next to you, and then you have this weird little interaction or situation that it's like an adrenaline rush to like make a connection these days with a stranger and just have these moments or these stories that we wouldn't have if we, were just sitting at home watching TV. Definitely. If we were lucky enough to have cable.
Yes. And then so you took your mom's car as well to do the journey, but also with planning, was there some planning in terms of how you would get the word out through different states or in different towns or cities, and how you would end up staying at people's houses? Was that initially, were there some plans, or was it more spontaneous?
I would say in the beginning, so I had my friend Jack Kohut here from Greenport. He had a drone at the time, and he took some cool videos of me driving my mom's car over the causeway. And then he took a little video of me explaining what I was trying to do. I told my story about the moment at the coffee shop, and then also how I wanted to go and stay in every single state. And, if someone had a old coworker or a friend or an uncle or aunt that would let me crash on their couch or in their guest room as I traveled through, let me know. And if they knew of any stories in their communities of people doing good or moments of kindness that had happened to them in their lives, please share it with the project. And so I posted that on Facebook in the beginning, a month and a half before I left. And people would tag friends and, and try to connect me with others in different states. I had a map hanging in the barn, and I would tack little Post-its of names and emails and on the states that lined up. But really, once I got on the road, and the Suffolk Times did an article once I had posted that, and they saw what I was doing, and then I thought, oh shoot, now I really have to do this. But then the New London Day picked it up also. That that area, Niantic, Connecticut, was my first stop on the trip. And so they did an article, and that kind of helped follow through the entire trip, local newspapers, just saying this person is traveling through. If you know of any stories or any connections, let her know. So the newspapers were a big help. And, the Providence Journal was the first one that a lot of it was a friend of a friend of a friend kind of thing. Like I never knew any of the people's homes necessarily. There were a couple I knew, but in the beginning, maybe they knew someone I knew. But by, I think, the seventh host, it was a woman that reached out from the Providence Journal, and she said, my daughter went off to college and I have a spare room. And so I stayed with her. And that was kind of the start. The next one was a woman in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. She reached out on Facebook, and her picture because she reached out on Facebook, I could click her. The other woman, it was just an email address. It gave my friends heart attacks. I didn't tell my dad half of this stuff to spare him. But, you know, they were like, you don't know anything about her. You didn't vet her. You know, she's a murderer. I was like, no, I think it'll be okay. So the next one that reached out because it was Facebook, I was like, all right, I'll click on her. So I clicked on her, and beautiful woman. She looked like she was in her 60s, strawberry blondish graying hair and a big sunbonnet. And she was riding a bicycle through like a blueberry bog or something. She had a basket with a puppy in the basket of her bike. And I thought, this is either like the nicest woman in the world that probably writes children's books, or she's a serial killer. I mean, it could go either way. And I ended up in her home just for one night in Cape Elizabeth. And she lived on this little, at the time she was taking care of the property for an older man, but it was called Turkey Hill Farm. And it was like straight out of a storybook. Again, perfect setting for a horror movie though. And I arrived at night, and it was dark, and it was December in Maine, so freezing. And I pulled in, and there's the old 100-year-old farm home with a blue door. And I go up and I knock on the door, and she says, come in. And so I push it open, and there's a wood stove going, and it's just like immediately just like warmth comes out the door. And the little puppy from the picture runs up to greet me. And, you know, on the stove is raspberry muffins or scones that she'd been making from the raspberries from her garden. And she comes out in her apron from the kitchen. She's making a little Italian dinner for us. And she walks out, and she just opens her arms. She goes, well, you're here. Welcome. And the record player is playing Eva Cassidy. And Eva Cassidy was a Canadian artist that actually passed from breast cancer, but she was so talented. Not a lot of people knew her. My mom always used to play her when she'd make dinner in our house. And so it was just like immediate, like, Mom, like, are you here? Like, it was crazy. And I'm not saying that all of my homes were like that by any means. But because that was one of the first total strangers homes, and to have that experience in it, I was like, I can do that. Like, I think that staying with the complete strangers is actually where this trip is going to flow. Like, it's nice every so often to stay with someone you know and kind of have a second to like take a breath and not feel like you have to be on. But the majority of the trip was you were on all the time, and meeting people and staying with these people. But they were getting so uplifted by it that it was like that was providing me the adrenaline to keep going when you shared a story, and you could see on their face you were making them feel better about the state of our country, especially when I left 4 days before the election of 2016.
Yes. And would you say the stories that were being told across the country, were there some overlapping similarities in what you've gathered through the stories, or were they all very different in terms of the acts of kindness or goodness?
I think there were definitely a lot of themes, which is helping in breaking down my book and figuring out how to write this. Staying with strangers was a lot easier than writing a book. But I think that the biggest themes I found were, or categories were like, you know, a stranger donating a kidney to a total stranger. And one of the specific ones that stuck out was two sisters that I met in Chicago. And they had their brother donated his kidney to their father so that, you know, he had some quality of life. He was sick most of their life. And then suddenly he had 8 years where he could play catch with them in the backyard and, you know, just be a father. And then he ended up having kidney failure again and passing. And so each sister, because they saw how much it helped what their brother did, each sister donated a kidney to a stranger in honor of their father. Just like insane kindness and generosity. What was amazing about that was that I was there that week. I thought someone was saying, oh, these girls did this and you should go have a coffee and find out about it. No, they were doing it that week. I was in the hospital with them after their surgery, sitting in the room with their mother and brother and these two sisters in like the most probably biggest moment of their entire lives. And there's me. And so it was really cool to like be ingrained in the stories too, instead of just sitting at a desk in New York receiving them via email. But the kidney donors were just like walking angels. There were families that lost a child and would start scholarships or help other children in honor of their kid. Those were really hard just because it, again, you're not just seeing the 1 second or hearing the 1 second speech of what they do now and all the people they helped. Like when you go to an event and you hear it, you're in their homes, seeing the like moments where it's not that easy, and, going through scrapbooks of their children and stuff. So, so those were the hardest stories, I think. And then there was little moments of kindness, whether someone was remembering a time where they were out to dinner and someone bought them and their boyfriend dinner, and it made them so happy that now once a year they do it for another couple, just like that paying it forward thing, because it happened and it made such an impact. And then there were the people that were just kind of like individual heroes. There was one kid that was my favorite. He was in Massachusetts, West Springfield, Ben. He was diagnosed with cancer, and when he went into remission, his mom said, how do you want to celebrate? We could go to Disney World, or like, what do you want to do? And he said, yeah, I just want to like get a bunch of toys and bring them to the kids still stuck at the hospital. So he did a huge toy drive. He dressed up like Captain America and he delivered hundreds of toys to Bay State Medical Center. So to get to be in that house with that mom who was a single mother and, run around outside and play tag with the kid, but take breaks because, he's still recovering from his cancer, and get that picture of him in his Captain America outfit. But yeah, so there was like kind of a that type of range of stories. But there was always a couple of randoms that would come out. I mean, I never went to meet a person with an intention of already knowing their story. My host would say, who are you meeting today? What did they do? And I don't know. They said they'd want to meet. We're meeting at this coffee shop. And a couple times they didn't have a story. They needed a friend. They had moved here from India and they couldn't find any friends right now, and they're struggling in this city, and they saw what I was doing in the paper and they reached out. Of course, I would pull a story out of them eventually after conversation, but their intention was they just needed to feel a little less alone for a minute, and my trip was supposed to be providing that. So it didn't really matter, what their story was or if it was good enough or anything. It was just kind of making time for people that needed it.
And also with the stories, it must have been somewhat of a challenge to just absorb a lot of the stories, whether you were still seeing acts of kindness, but people were still dealing with either things that were happening that you were talking to them about, and then also linking that with just traveling and being on the road. How did you balance absorbing a lot of this information? Because I could just see it being still much like could be a roller coaster in terms of emotions and dealing with different people and different states. And how do you kind of balance all those things that were happening throughout your trip?
Not well. Can't say I did a great job at that. I remember meeting a woman in St. Louis, and she was a funeral director. I was staying with a woman at the time who donated her time around Christmas to play the harp at a remembrance mass. So I went with her, and we were, she was playing the harp and I was kind of mingling around, and it was all these different families that had lost someone. And I looked over at the funeral director, and she must have been in her 40s, blonde, bubbly thing, and just like such a great energy. And I was like, how is she doing it? If you're an optimistic person, you always look at other people that are optimistic and you're like, how are you doing it? Because we know deep down inside, it's like, it's a challenge every day. People are like, oh, she's always so positive. But it's like, no, it's hard. It's just a nicer choice, I think, for everyone involved. But anyway, I remember being like, what's her secret? I got to figure this out. So I walked over and I kind of talked to her for a minute, and I said, because again, like I said, the talking with the families that lost a child was so challenging, and I would drive away from their homes just crying for hours to the next stop, which will inevitably be more sadness or whatever story that would be. So she said, I imagine a body of water between us. They're on the other side, and I can see them and I can offer my support and try to help them cope, but it's their pain, and I'm on this side and the water is separating us, and I can't take that on. It's not mine. And I'm just sitting there the whole time while she's creating this beautiful visual, And I'm imagining like I put 2 bowling balls on both my feet when I started this road trip, and I just jumped into that river. I was like, I'm coming in with you guys. So I had a really hard time separating from it. But I think that it also, you know, it was the blessing and a curse, because like there's this one very vivid memory of a family who lost their child. And I remember they said he was a young boy, and he would always come in the back door, and the screen door would always slam. And they're like, oh my God, it was so annoying. The screen door just kept slamming and slamming and slamming. Anyway, very young, passed away. And I remember sitting there, and the mom said, I would do anything to hear that screen door slam one more time. And so it changes your perspective so drastically, like every little thing. Because when you have a loved one or someone doing this a little annoyance, it's like, in the grand scheme of things, does this matter? Like, imagine a time when you won't have that annoyance anymore, and is it worth getting in this fight with or whatever. But so it was definitely really hard, though. I think that that's why it's taking so long to write the book, I think, because it's like reliving it and just processing it still. But at the end of the day, I mean, I wasn't being forced to do this trip. This was my choice. So I had to own that. And yeah, it was going to be hard, but you could stop, but I would never do that because that's giving up. So I think that just like knowing that finish line would be in sight, and like visualizing the causeway, like every day. I had a complete vision, Ozzy Osbourne, Mama, I'm Coming Home, blasting on the radio, and just going down that causeway and being done and parking the car. Like I just thought of that all the time. And so it was very surreal when it actually happened. It was like, oh, this is just one of those visual, oh no, we're actually here. It's done.
Even early on in the trip, when you were like, because I think you started up in New England and came down, but even early on, you were visualizing that
every day
moment.
Driving for when Jack took that video, and I was driving the car, I was already like, okay, you have to start visualizing this, because then it will come to life. Now, I thought it would be a year later. So the joke was on me on that one. It was, 3 years later. But I think that just having that visual, it helps, because you really, I mean, I got off the road and immediately said Alaska was my favorite state by far. I never said that before. I felt like it was kind of a weird trip to be doing. I wasn't always seeing the landmarks or seeing something, specific about the state. I was seeing the people and meeting the people of every state. So I always felt it was like hard to answer that question. But when I went to Alaska, something shifted, and it was like everyone just knew what was going on in their communities. They were so involved. I went into a grocery store on the first day, and I always had my More Good t-shirt on for the trip. And a woman came over and said, "You're finally here." They had repurposed the Washington Post article 6 months ago. It had been 6 months since then, and I finally am in Alaska. And she remembered the article. She knew who I was. Like, it was just, everyone was so involved and aware and neighborly, and just an amazing experience. And I said, I'm going to be back here. I'm going to go back. And I don't know how or when, but I'm going to figure this out. I'm just going to get back again. And next weekend, I'm moving back to Alaska for the summer. And things just kind of worked their way together. But when I was looking at the newspaper article from when I was there 4 years ago, it was in Homer, which is the town I'm going to be back in, working on a farm there. But it was the guy had written in the article about my trip, and then he wrote Latham 37, and then whatever else he had written, and it was a mistake. It was 4 years ago. I was 33, and but I never corrected him and whatever. But it was just so weird to see that and realize I'm going back and I'm 37. It was like it was already written, so I think that it helps. I have to visualize things, and then they kind of hopefully come to life. Not exactly the way we see them, but it definitely helps.
Yes. Was there a moment where you were kind of like, I can't continue on it, or I got to turn around at all, or was it
every day? No, I'm just kidding.
Because I could see maybe mentally you were like, I can do this, but then like, how do the rest of yourself kind of can your body continue to?
I think my body and my mind had definitely would have differing answers on this one. My mind, there was not a moment where I thought I wasn't going to finish. There just wasn't. My body tried to shut it down many times. I got diagnosed with chronic Lyme disease when I was in California. going to bed every night for weeks crying because I had such bad restless leg, my knee joints, everything. It didn't help that you're driving every day under a massive amount of stress and anxiety trying to figure your life out alone in the country, which did not help the joints. But I think that mentally, if I had gotten off the road and not finished and then got back on the road years later or whatever, or figured out another way to finish it, I think that would have destroyed me more. I knew that I'd set a goal and I had to do it. But I met this woman in Wichita, Kansas on my trip who kind of got me through the rest of the trip. She had been walking into a phone store right the week before going back to school. She was a guidance counselor, and the phone store got robbed when she was in there. She was shot 3 times. She ended up in the hospital. They gave her special medication because everything was shutting down and they had to preserve her organs. So the medication shuts blood flow off to your arms and legs. So she had her arms from her elbows down removed and her legs from her knees down. So went quadriplegic, and she ended up, or I guess quad amputee. I have to figure out how to word that properly. But she got out of the hospital 145 days later and was in recovery for a little bit, and then wasn't feeling well again shortly after, went back into the hospital and got diagnosed with breast cancer. And you kind of just think, like, how can someone handle that much? Mm-hmm. And her story for me was about a man who had been at one of her events that she was speaking at. She was speaking at an event for policemen and talking about how that policeman was the hero because he ran after the guy with the gun. And while she was speaking, there was a man in the audience sitting next to her sister. And her sister was telling the man, you know, she's been really struggling because insurance covered the legs, the prosthetics, but they won't cover the arms. It's like, you're already going through this so much and now you can't. It's unbelievable. Anyway, so she was telling him he worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield. So he started trying to figure out anything he could do to help her, and he couldn't figure anything out. He was a millionaire from DC, so he ended up purchasing her 2 mechanical arms. They were each like $275,000. Wow. Him and his wife delivered them to her house the week before Christmas. So that was her story for me. But she was the story. You know, like just meeting this woman and seeing what she'd gone through. I mean, shortly after getting her prosthetic, she already did a 5K. She goes into hospitals now and she helps people if they've tragically lost a limb or something. She'll go and sit with them and help them. And she's funny too. She'll be like, you only lost 1, I lost all 4, you'll be fine. But I asked her, I was just like, Julie, like, how do you do this? How do you do it? And she said, you know, there was a moment when I had gotten home after the hospital and I was laying on the couch and I was like 80 pounds now. And, you know, I was laying there and I thought I could just pull this sheet right over my head with my half a limb and give up, or I can buck up and make the best of this. And so she did. And her husband quit his job at the time, or he ended up working remotely from home. I can't remember, but he had to take care of her pretty seriously in the beginning. Now she's extremely independent. She does, like, her hair and her makeup looked amazing when I saw her. She did it all on her own. It was just, she's incredible. She drives now. She got like a special car and everything. Wow. But she's very independent. But in the beginning, you know, her husband was there to help her and everything. And she would tell me sometimes at night, like she would, you know, still, like, it was so weird because the leg's not there, but you'd get like a cramp in that area and everything like that. And she'd try to turn over. And I was like, well, wouldn't you wake your husband up? She's like, oh, you know, he's been through so much already. I'm not gonna. And so I would think about her. I left her in Wichita and then I drove to Kansas City, and it was like a 3-hour drive, I think. I cried the entire 3 hours because I kept imagining her in bed with a cramp, sitting in the pain because she didn't want to inconvenience anyone else. So she was just there. And I thought, she's going to wake up tomorrow morning and live her life so I can get back in the car for another day. And so she kind of like motivated me through the trip because it was like, we can really do anything we set our mind to. And if she can, I sure can.
Yeah. And it was over 3 years. Were there breaks in between there, or did you keep going?
So I did have to come back to New York a few times. I think there was about 10 or 11 times, I think 10, that I parked my car And I flew back to New York to shoot weddings to keep my business and my wallet alive.
Because you didn't have any other money coming in.
Right. Yeah. I did a fundraiser in the beginning and got like $30,000 for the gas tank. But honestly, staying with the people, I wore the same outfit pretty much. I mean, I had like 5 or 6 of the more good t-shirts, 2 pairs of jeans and my Converses. And that was pretty much my uniform. So that made it easy not to have to worry about that. And then staying with people, they provided you a place to stay, and then they usually fed you dinner. I would meet a lot of my stories in between all my hosts. I met stories all the time at coffee shops or in their homes. And sometimes, depending on the story or the person, maybe I'd buy coffee, maybe they'd buy coffee. Sometimes I would go to the bathroom and, I guess when I was in the bathroom, they'd slip a $50 bill in my backpack with a little note that said for gas money or something that I'd find later. In Texas, actually, it was like 1 billion degrees in the summertime, and I'd crack my windows. And someone read my website on the back of the car, and they put an envelope with a $100 bill in the crack of the window and said, I love what you're doing. Here's some gas money. There were a lot of those moments. Sometimes I had car trouble, and then I ended up in a home with a mechanic, and he'd help the car out. People would give me gas cards sometimes. The trip really led itself, which is why it thought it would have a plan in the beginning, and then realized the best plan is to not have a plan and just kind of let the stories and the people guide you. So I always knew where I'd stay at least a few days in advance when I never got into a town blindly. People offering their homes was the easiest part of the trip. People offering their stories was the most challenging, because they never thought their stories were important enough or mattered enough. But some of the smaller stories were the most important, because they're so translatable. I mean, we can all do these tiny moments. We can buy someone behind us a coffee, So they are just as important to tell. But yeah, so 10 times throughout, I would park the car, I would fly back, I would shoot a few weddings either over a long weekend or over 3 weeks if it was summer and I really needed to keep that business going. And then I would, I'd get back on the road. One wedding I came back to shoot right before the end of my trip. There was actually 10 couples, including the bride and groom, but guests at the wedding of couples that I had photographed their wedding. So one of those last photos was all these couples that I had already been part of their wedding. And so that was really cool, because it's such a testament to out here. You shoot one wedding and then you go through a couple of their friends and you stay in touch with them, and then maybe you do family photos for them and stuff. And so a couple of those families were really supportive of the trip too, which is really cool.
Yeah. And even with all these stories, and you talked about kind of some of the changes that were going on in the country and some of the challenges that we're facing, and even still today in some of the divides, but even just talking with a wide range of people from different states and maybe different opinions and backgrounds on things that, say, you might not agree with, but were you still able to still connect with them and still understand their story? Not that you might have brought up politics.
No, gosh, I'm not trying to get killed in these homes. People almost never brought up politics to me. It was really beautiful. I think for them it was a breath of fresh air. But I stayed in Trump homes, Hillary homes, Bernie homes, atheist homes, very religious homes. It didn't really matter. And maybe they would broach the topic and I would listen. Even if I didn't agree with it, I wouldn't engage in it, but I would listen. I really don't see, when people are saying all these things, I don't see you as, okay, you voted for someone I wouldn't have voted for, and now I don't like you.
Yes.
I try to understand it. Why did you vote for this person? Like, and then I have a better understanding maybe of the person they voted for. But I really, I've always had that mindset way before the trip in my life, where if I'm driving down the road and someone, speeds around me and is being a punk, and someone would usually say, oh, this, whatever words we don't say on a podcast. But I always think, yeah, he's obviously rushing his wife to the hospital because she's in labor. And maybe he's not. But it's a nicer way to live your life, to think the latter. I think that he's just, there's so many people out there that, we immediately assume it's an attack on us, and it rarely has anything to do with us. And I think when, it's like the tale as old as time with like the bully in school. Like he obviously must be getting bullied at home or something's going on. This kid just wasn't born to beat the other kid up on the playground. Like, trying to figure out where it's coming from instead of, judging it or getting angry or whatever. And so I think that with the trip that there was definitely homes I would go in where, maybe just the wife invited me and didn't even tell her husband I was coming. And now it's already awkward for me and I'm showing up to this home. And then the husband thinks, here's some, granola eating, doesn't shave her legs, rainbow spreading kindness girl from New York doing some weird hippie trip, blah, blah, blah. People are going to think what they're going to think. But once we got to sit down, at first it was exhausting having to prove yourself all the time. But once you sat down and got through to them, it was the most satisfying thing. I had a guy email me 2 years after my trip was over. And he said he was a boyfriend of someone I stayed with at the time. They were no longer together. He must have been in his 50s, I guess. And he said, I just wanted to reach out to you because when I met you on your trip, I was so skeptical of you. And I think it was because I was in such a bad place. I didn't understand what you were doing. But we had become Facebook friends, and I didn't remember him being this bad, but I guess he thought he was terrible. We had become Facebook friends after I had stayed with him and the woman, and so he had followed the whole trip now. And so he said, I can't believe you did this, and I followed along, and it always cheers me up to read the stories. And I've actually just left my job. I'm going to be on a sailboat for a year. I'm taking this leap of faith. You were the first person I thought of, and I just wanted to reach out and apologize, and I get it now. And it was just so cool. And this is like, in the grand scheme of things, it was 5 years since I had met the guy. And so I think when you can help shift a perspective a little bit, you can't change a person, but I think maybe you can change a little bit of the way they see some things. It makes it worth it.
Yes. And also you had it's a Subaru Outback. That car had a lot of miles on it, and I thought I remember reading there was something with help from Subaru.
Yeah.
Or even like the vice president of...
He hosted.
Okay.
He was a host on my road trip. And so, when he originally reached out, it was kind of like, have Mary's people reach out. We'd love to have her come in. I was like, hi, yeah, it's me. Organization of one. And so I ended up in his home a week after his wife had gotten out of the hospital with C. diff and was deathly ill. And, she was an angel. She took me in anyway because her husband had already arranged it. But we completely connected. They had one daughter at the time that is now my fake little sister, and we've stayed in touch ever since. And they've come out. I've taught her how to drive in the Subaru on the back roads in Orient. And so that was an awesome connection. I'm really glad that it came at the end to connect with them, because had they reached out in the beginning, I think I would have loved any help I could get, because I had no idea what I was doing. And I was doing the website. I was updating the social media pages. I was trying to order shirts from East End Sporting Goods and have them mailed in boxes to whatever house I was in to guess and figure out what maybe the next host will have in Mississippi. Like, what size will they be? So it was a lot of moving parts and figuring stuff out while also being completely alone in these homes. So I think that to be able to say at the end of the day that it wasn't sponsored except for literally by solely human kindness felt so good. It was just so authentic and grassroots, and it just every single little moment along the way of the people that helped me, whether I got a flat tire in Kansas City and the woman I was supposed to collect a story from who, had absolutely no money, insisted on paying the $17 to get it patched, and then ended up in the next place where they donated the wheel that I needed. It was just little moments all along the way that kind of kept me going, but really kept the car going. But thank goodness I did stay with them, because they brought the car in and checked on it, and the engine was not doing great, so they fixed that right up. But yeah, it was nice to connect with them. And then I ended up speaking at their national conference 2 months after I got off the road. I went to Orlando, Florida, and got to talk to all of them. They all ordered more good shirts. And so to see a sea of 800 people in the audience wearing your More Good shirt felt pretty cool.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. And coming to the end of your trip, coming back to Orient, was that, what was that, 2019? Now, that was before COVID.
Yeah.
So I think you felt that felt good that you were done, but also very draining and exhausted by the end. But at that moment, what were your thoughts once you kind of got back? Were you kind of like, what do I got to do now? Or should I just take a break and hold off on the processing of the book because I've just processed all these stories? And or did you feel that you had to go back and do something even, say, before the pandemic kind of started?
Well, I was definitely absolutely drained. I think that there were so many emotions kind of tying into that last mile on the causeway. But I think that I've beaten myself up a lot in the last few years of not getting the book done yet. And I've kind of finally come to a place, as the writing has picked up now, finally, but of realizing that girl that got off the road that day could have never written this book. You know, we all change like every single day. It's like we're a little bit different of a human. And the person you are today is completely different from the person you were 5 years ago. I mean, I think the important bits we keep, luckily. But I think that I was sad and angry. And I think that a book I wrote in that moment would have been the book I wanted to write. And it wouldn't have really shown what I wanted to show. And there were challenges and hard parts, and it was so sad. You know, all these stories were shrouded in this darkness. And it was really about resilience and how we keep moving forward after it, because that's what life is. And it's really lovely to have someone buy you a coffee. But the reason it's so lovely is because wherever you were mentally that day and how desperately you needed someone to show you some type of kindness. You know, I remember my sister was at the grocery store a couple days after I got off the road. And she had been at home with her daughter, was like, 6-month-old and a 2-year-old or something. And she was in the middle of making dinner and she forgot like a key ingredient. I can't remember, eggs or something. And so she puts them all back into the car because she's home alone, and she runs to the IGA, and, she lives 10 minutes, 8 minutes from the IGA. So she gets here and she goes in and she gets her stuff. And then, of course, when you're in the IGA, then you see this and that and this. Suddenly it's $40 of things. She gets to the line and realizes she forgot her wallet at home. And so she's like, oh my gosh. And she's so frazzled, and she's, her husband works in the Riverhead jail, so he's working all the time. So she's like under a lot of stress trying to figure out this whole mom life with these 2 little babies. And her sister's been off of staying with strangers for 3 years, so that didn't help her. And so she gets, realizes and tells the woman, I have to go back and get my wallet. Will you hold this for me? And the woman behind her said, I'll get it. And she's like, no. Like, well, let me take this stuff out. And she said, let me get it. And she lost it. Like, she just started crying. And she's like, my sister just got off the road 2 days ago collecting stories like of people like you, like, of all these moments. But it's the moment sticks out so much. I mean, kindness is always happening. We're just not always seeing it. And we see it so much clearer when we're in our own dark spots. And so I think those moments when someone can offer to do something, or there's just this niceness that's offered, you don't forget it. And that was really the coolest part of staying with all these strangers. I think that it was serving as a reminder to them too. Like, they'd hear all my stories, and then 2 or 3 days later, they'd be like, I forgot to tell you after you left, I was thinking about my 2nd grade teacher, and or whatever, this moment I forgot about. It was like forcing them down this memory lane. One host said it best. I stayed with her in Minnesota, and she was a single mom of 2 children that had severe cerebral palsy, wheelchair bound. Like, her life was to be in that home and see what she had to endure. But I was packing up and leaving her house, and I remember she was sitting in the kitchen sink, and she looked at me and she said, I always knew there was good things in my life, and that I had nice things happen, but the last few years have just been so hard. And ever since you got here, it's like you shook up this like snow globe of my life for me. And now all the joy is out there, and it's all I'm seeing and remembering. It was like such a beautiful visual. But I think it was kind of like you were acting as this reminder to people of like, you really have to take a look back at your life and think about the people that helped you, or these moments, because those are the moments that we have to kind of keep in our pockets for a day. Like, next fall for our election time. And to remember those happy things to kind of get us through the harder times.
Well, with your project and even post the journey, do you feel that even with similar to the social media, because social media has been kind of starting up around 2008, 2005, and it's gotten more involved in the society and culture, but just in the way people might interact with that and well, like you said, you don't have a TV to watch the news on, which is, I think, probably a good thing. In some ways, I think some people might say that, well, we need to know at least a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah,
but it's
absolutely.
like you still need to balance, because you can get into a habit with some of the algorithms and how it will show you the same thing over and over again of what, if you want to see not just negative news, but certain types of biased news in certain ways. And do you think with your project you're countering some of that negativity even now with just showcasing more stories? But I think it's hard to get people out of that habit. I think in some ways it can be addicting.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We're always going to stare at the car accident.
Yes. So I don't know if it's training ourselves to understand that we are absorbing more information than we were, say, 50 years ago, and where we would have gotten things on the newspaper, and there might have been a headline for, say, World War II was starting, but then there were still other things going on throughout the country, that there was still kindness going on and resilience, but just kind of balancing that today. And just what you think of that, and with your project's connection and moving forward as a society, and how we kind of change the way we're processing things, though we might be hard to.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean,
Sorry, that was a long rant.
Sorry, the question? No, I'm just kidding. No, I think I know what you're trying to say. And I think that just as a side note, ironically, I actually do still not have a television, which my friends think is hilarious because they're like, you complained all the time. But I obviously have a computer and a phone, and I am not aware of the news. I think the best way to state it is a quote I heard recently from RuPaul. He said, "I look at the darkness. I just don't stare at it." And I thought that was a really beautiful way to put it, but also exactly how I feel. I'm not naive to things that happen. And I think that's why I was so sensitive to the way some people termed my trip. I think a lot of people didn't know what I was doing. Oh, wonderful. A trip of kindness, sprinkling rainbows around America. No, I felt like I was at war out there, trying to find like-minded people and connect to these stories and share them with other people. And, people would send, oh, you got to try this ice cream shop. It's like, that is not, anyway. I love ice cream, but I think it was just, it's a choice that we have to make every single day. And I spent 3 years finding it and being a recipient of so much kindness. And I still struggle every single day to wake up and be optimistic. I think it's really important to remember that we can be part of the solution instead of the problem. And I think social media has made it the opposite of that. I think we just think that we're, contributing by being online and saying our comments, even though most of them are negative, or, just half the stuff we're saying, or most of the stuff we're saying on our phone or our Snapchat or Instagram or wherever. Would we say that to their face? Where we have this like safety behind the screen. And I think that's the problem. When you were little, and unbeknownst to you, maybe because you were so young, you said something about, this person looks kind of fat, or this person has a pimple on their face. And then you saw that person's reaction and you saw that they were hurt, and you did that. That doesn't make you feel good. And then you understand it. But that doesn't happen on the screen. We're just saying mean things and putting it out there, and that's it. I mean, some guy in Maine, I remember when I first started the trip, he obviously didn't even read the article, but he was like, oh, I hope this girl has a lot of fun frolicking around on her mom's dead money. Must be nice to like not have to work or what, I don't even remember what he said because I put it so far out of my mind now. But I remember at the time I pulled over to check my email. I read it, and I immediately had like a horrible stomach ache. And one of my best friends called me to check in, and I told her what it said. And she said, Mary, I love you and I love what you're doing. But that doesn't mean that there still aren't some a-holes out there. Mm-hmm. You just keep driving. And so I think that we live in this world where like you're not being held accountable for mm-hmm. what you're saying or what you're doing or how you're making people feel. And so I try to stay off of it. I mean, it's so annoying though, because in this day and age and you're trying to publish a book, you kind of have to have a social media mm-hmm. presence. And also the amount of people that respond positively and kindly and say how much reading one of the stories helped them makes it worth it to me. So, mm-hmm. I just go on, I post my stuff and I get off. Mm-hmm. Maybe I look at like the Good News Movement or something, like one of those positive pages. Yes. But I think mostly I just try to stay off of it. And we all have our roles. I can't necessarily change people's minds or do anything specific while we're getting this upcoming election. But I can do what I know how to do, which is to keep sharing these happy stories. So if for 1 minute it can take you away from your anger or negativity to read a happy story and feel happy for a second, then that's what I can provide. Mm-hmm. And I think remembering that for everyone, like just kind of doing mm-hmm. their part and doing some type of small thing, as Miss Rumphius said in my favorite children's book, leave the world a little bit more beautiful than, when you leave. And so I think that just remembering to contribute in some type of small way towards the good is the most important thing we can do. And I think mm-hmm. that, things are bad. I mean, back in 2016, it was the worst election year ever. And like the world needs good more than ever. But it's like we used to have some pretty bad wars. I mean, the Holocaust was pretty bad. I mean, there has been bad things all the time.
Yeah, kind of reminding ourselves how even in the past, not just recent, how people have continued to move forward. And then even looking to the future, I mean, I think you would still be able to find more kindness in the world than negativity. Yeah. I think it's just in terms of what gets more of a wider view.
And more exposure, really. Yeah. Because now we're exposed to so much more, so we feel like everything's so much worse. But there were horrible things happening all over the world before social media that we just mm-hmm. didn't know about. I think that we're exposed to too much. Mm-hmm. And we have to have a limit. Like you said, I look at it, I don't stare at it. I mean, unless it's something you can start to help out in some way, mm-hmm. Then yes, definitely. But if you're just going to sit and do nothing about it and stare at all the bad news and get more depressed and then be a negative, angry person in your community that then is ruining other people, like how is that helping? Mm-hmm.
And having a bad conversation online that isn't really helping the situation, and you're just talking with someone on there and saying things that don't help out. And then also with your book, and you mentioned it, that you're still working on a book for the hospitals. But are you also writing like a memoir mm-hmm. as well?
Yeah, so that's also makes it harder when you try to write two at the same time. But it felt like it was going to help because you're kind of going along the same memory lane at the same mm-hmm. time. So, but yeah, the book for the hospitals is more like a coffee table style book, where I'd really like to do it like Tom's shoes. When you buy a pair of shoes and it donates a pair. So if you wanted to buy this book for a friend or a family member that could use some cheering up or just wanted to see good in America, you could buy them one and then it would donate one. And you could pick what state and what hospital it went to. And maybe you're putting it in a hospital where you had an uncle or someone that was in that hospital. So it kind of becomes everyone's book. And then the other book is more of kind of like my life since my mom died and 80%, 90% the trip, but just kind of the decisions I made that led me to the road.
And how is that progressing?
I would say the memoir is further along. Like I would say like I've definitely have my like very, very, very rough, but almost done first draft of that. And then the coffee table book is harder to see because it's snippets and I don't work in it chronologically. So I think I'm further along than I give myself credit for. I would gauge 3/4 through that. But there's still a lot of I'm still visualizing it right now, and I don't have it completely clear. So I think that has been hard to imagine it done when you don't really see it yet. But I think the other one, it was more important to finish. I think I had to write my own story first before kind of figuring out how to write everyone else's, because it's so daunting. It's their stories told through my eyes of witnessing it, but still, you want to give it the justice it deserves when it's these families who have been through so much. And so kind of figuring that out has been a challenge.
Yeah. And just another question, reflecting on the trip, since it's been a few years now, what do you think your mother would be most proud of with what you did? And do you think she would have been surprised at the whole project and the success that it's brought people across the country, and even just on the North Fork, but just thinking about what she might have thought about it?
I think that, I hope she'd be proud.
Yeah.
Again, like we were talking about in the beginning, I don't think this is what she had in mind by any means, but I think the thing that she'd be the most proud of, and the thing that I've tried to kind of carry on the most, is something that she had too, and it's just her, I don't know if it's personality, it's like her energy or her passion. I feel like when I leave people, I want them to feel a little bit better in whatever capacity. Either I told them a joke and they laughed, or I listened to them because they needed a person to talk to for a second, or, whatever I can do to kind of be there for the people that are in front of me, no matter what I'm going through. There were so many times on my trip, whether I was going through a breakup or, had a horrible stomach ache that day, or hadn't really slept at my host's house that night before, or whatever it was. The next morning when I was sitting there with that story, the only important thing was them and what I was supposed to be doing on this trip. And I think I learned that from her, because a lot of people didn't even know she was sick. She just always carried this smile with her. So I guess I'm just still trying to carry that, and I think she'd be proud of that kind of relentless optimism.
Yes. I was thinking just about your mom, with not, maybe even just her personality, with not showing that she's going through all these things, and would still just continue to thrive, even if hearing that news and everything, that having cancer. And did she have it?
She was diagnosed when I was 11. So I was in 7th grade at the time, and it was towards the end of 7th grade. My sister was going off to college, and I have 3 other siblings, but they're all older than me. So I was the only one home when she went through it, and she did not want me to know a lot of it. So she was hiding that a lot too. And I think because, I'm someone that has detrimental empathy to my health. So I think she saw that and knew that about me at a very young age. And so she knew how affected I would get. And she so appreciated my horrible jokes and humor, and whatever I was providing her was more important. So she just kept that version of me going to help her kind of get through her treatments and stuff. But it wasn't until years later that she, I found out how sick she had been and all these things that she hid from me. But yeah, I think she was just a person that had exuded resilience, and also just affected so many people that we didn't even know about till after she passed. The UPS guy who sat down on the front step and was crying because apparently she would always talk to him. His wife had passed from breast cancer too, and she would invite him in and sit and talk with him. Just people like that came out of the woodwork that we didn't even know. It was just, she was just a really incredible person. And I think that me going out on the road was really kind of, she always taught me how to put one foot in front of the other, despite whatever was thrown at us. But then she was gone. And so I think that the trip was really me going out there and searching for more people to teach me that. And that's really what they all were. I mean, all these different people, especially Julie, like figuring out how to keep moving forward after we go through something. And so they kind of became all my new guides.
And do you, even now, do you still receive stories?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people will send stories sometimes, or they'll just be like, it's so cool when they're like, oh, I saw this and I immediately thought of you, or something like that. Like, I'm just like this channel for them in order to, they have to share something good happened to them. People that would never usually message me, or we'd see each other once a year, would be like, this happened today and I had to share it with you. So that's really cool to kind of be that conduit to like get that information and sometimes put it out there. And also I, with the help of my two sisters, have now set up a nonprofit for more good. And so being able to still go within our community, like the project we did at the library, but being able to do little small events, just because that's the stuff that really gets me excited. You know, the trip was socializing every 5 seconds for 3 years, and then sitting alone in isolation to write about it has been really hard. So I think these events kind of help keep the momentum.
And separate from the two books, or what other kind of projects do you have in mind in the future?
Well, I like to work with Sarah and Dan at First and South a lot. They're awesome. And so they always placate me in my ridiculous ideas. And then, you know, Sarah brings me back down to earth and thinks of even better ideas and stuff. So, so it's awesome to be able to have them. But really right now, the most recent thing that my sisters and I were discussing was trying to figure out how to maybe do a grant with Greenport High School, or, you know, a couple other local high schools once we can figure it out, but just kind of seeing, you know, having them write a grant application of what they see in their community and where they think there's need and what they would do if they were given $100. And so kind of just starting to put it in like the concept of philanthropy and that mindset for high school students. I talked to a lot of schools throughout my trip. I would get in front of auditoriums of teenagers, which was the scariest thing in the world, and share the story. And so it was cool to kind of see their reactions. And I think they need to hear it. You know, they're terrified. They're always like, you stayed with strangers, you're insane. But it's like, that was the least scary part of the trip. Like the social, like I was exhausting to be social all the time, but the people were wonderful. And I couldn't have done it without them.
And then just focusing on the North Fork now, with you living out here and working out here, just kind of thinking from your childhood to now, what have you enjoyed the most about living and working out here?
I guess the small town feeling of it. I mean, it's so beautiful here. But also just, yeah, like the community. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I think I'm like finally in that stage of my life where I'm appreciating it even more. I mean, also, you know, she says this day is before leaving it again for a few months. But I think that feeling of coming back home always felt defeating in a way. And I wouldn't say that I'm ever really permanently back. So I think that helps me. Like I'm always still moving around. I have a hard time staying still. But for so long, it was just mostly a reminder of somewhere that my mom wasn't anymore. And I think that finally changing the narrative on that recently has kind of helped me be more excited to be back in a place where she used to be, and that she still feels like she's everywhere, and be close to my family. I had one niece when I got on the road, and now I have 7 nieces and nephews.
Wow.
So being near them has been really special. And yeah, I think it's a really wonderful place. I think, you know, we still have a lot to figure out of how to all get along with, you know, the new people coming in, the old people. I did join the Polar Bear Club, and that helped kind of meet a lot of the new people that have moved out here, and they're lovely. And the cold water swimming was lovely, even though it sounds crazy. It was very helpful for the Lyme disease in the joints. But yeah, I think just kind of, it's just a really sweet community. And First and South is such a good, not to like keep plugging them, but there's such a good hub for it, because it's like one of those feelings where you go in and it's like cheers, or like you see someone you know or whatever, or it's just a nice feeling. And I think there's a lot of places like that out here. It's very rare to not run into people you know everywhere you go. And it's a nice feeling. Helping your neighbors, stuff like that. Like, you know, when I lived in New York City, I didn't know the person that lived next to me. Like if their apartment was burning down, I didn't have their key, you know, like there was no, but here I can call my neighbors and be like, can you guys go feed my cat? I forgot to, or something like that, you know, so that's awesome.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned about just the community kind of coming together. I think a lot of people have talked about or worried about making sure that the community still stays together. But just in terms of the future, what do you hope for the future of the North Fork and its community down the line?
I mean, I think what you're doing, I think I commend you. Like, I think that getting these local stories out there and hearing more, you know, my sister was just listening to Mr. Jesters, and his daughter Amanda is her best friend. She knows him very well, and she learned so much about him from that interview. Yes. I think that telling the stories of the people that are from here is so important, just to keep that history going. You know, I'm very aware of it now because my great grandfather started the Historical Society in Orient. He was one of the people that started that, and so just to remember the history and being able to talk to my father, and I should be talking to him way more and recording him, but you know, just little things like him telling me that one of the beaches in Orient used to be, you know, called Halleck Dock because that's where they get the potato farming and everything like that. Well, now, you know, some of the people coming out here call it Dog Beach. So then I, you know, politely correct them jokingly, but like, you know, I go for walks with this one woman who moved out here. I told her, then she told her daughter. Now, like, it's just cool, like to keep those memories and keep that history going. And so I think that's really important to kind of tell these stories. And it was so cool, even when you asked me about my ancestors, to, you know, my best friends from preschool, they are going to be out this weekend, and we started a book club. So we'll be reviewing our first book that we chose. And when you asked me that question, I put on the group thread, I said, you know, by the way, I had to start looking into my ancestry. And they're like, okay, Mary, yeah, you're like on the Mayflower, which I wasn't. but they're like, you have so much history. And I was like, well, I don't know it though. Like, I had to ask my dad about it. And one of my friends, you know, Nicole Churchy, her father's a chiropractor in Southold, she was all excited about it. And she started asking him, and found out that, you know, her great-great-grandmother had a lemon grove in Italy, and then it burnt down and they had to come to Brooklyn. And like, but it's so cool to not just know your friends, but know that history. And so many people don't. And so if you have the people still alive in your life, start asking the questions.
Yes, definitely. That's something that I think people, I mean, obviously people have a lot of things going on in their lives, and maybe that's not the first thing that comes to mind, but I think it is, like you said, an important thing just to kind of understand and have people kind of think about where they came from and how things have evolved, and then kind of coming to the future with it. So I know some people might not want to
want to dig into it. Yeah, I mean, it's a sensitive subject for some people, but for certain things that you do want to know, you have to ask. I mean, it's my biggest regret with my mom not being able to ask her. You know, being in your young 20s, you're not thinking of stuff like that, and now she's gone. So I think that that history does leave once the people do, and so it's important, whatever it is, good or bad, to kind of get down. But yeah,
definitely. And then I usually just ask if was anything else you'd like to discuss or say, or that we haven't touched on or talked about.
I guess just that for me, my biggest realization from the whole trip and what my mom said was really not about that there was more good out there. It was kind of her last 5 words, if you look for it. And I think that that's kind of what I would want to leave at the end of this, is just for all of us to remember, like, you have to like look for it. You have to dig it up. You know, we're not going to see it if we're walking around the grocery store on our phones, checking Instagram. You know, you really have to look up, because the need is everywhere. There's constant opportunities to be the good, let alone see the good. And I think that just that awareness and reminder to kind of keep looking.
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in today. It was a real pleasure to talk with you and have you share your story here and just the whole process of the journey and everything. I can tell what it meant to you and what it means to you still moving forward with your mom and telling the stories and you're still working on it today. So I just want to congratulate you on all you're doing for the community here and for good around the world. So I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 55 with Mary Latham. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.